Hi there, this is Marcy, and thanks for watching my presentation about how there is no writing in math. Or is there? So I started out my research question with looking at how can students make connections between their learning and the process that it took to get there? But more specifically, looking at how can routine reflection aid students in selecting the most effective strategies to support literacy tasks across the curriculum. And again, I was really focusing on that routine reflection. So, coming up with something that my kids could eventually use on their own to kind of help them be more aware of what they're learning, what concepts they're applying, and then being able to decide what are the best ways to solve certain problems. So, why reflection? I kind of think of reflection as kind of like that old saying where if you give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day, but if you teach him how to fish, he'll eat for a lifetime. And I kind of feel the same way about learning, where if you teach a student information, they'll know it for a period of time, usually however long it takes them to take the test, right? But if you teach a kid how to learn, then they're going to learn for a lifetime. And so that's what I really focused on with this is reflection. So it really promotes an awareness of the why of learning. So if kids are aware of how and why they're using a certain strategy, they're going to be able to recall that and apply it in different situations in the future. It provides kids with opportunities to improve. So when they're aware of who they are as a learner and they take time to consider when they feel successful and things that impede that success, they're able to do more of the former in order to really promote that positive self-image of themselves as learners. And then there's also longevity of retention. So reflections allow kids to make personalized meaning out of their learning. And so because they're linking that learning to prior experiences and understandings, they're more likely to remember that information. It's going to be more likely to stick because it's personal. So, what is reflection? There's a definite process to experiences that prompt reflection, and they all start with a disruption in a usual process or routine. So, something unexpected. And that's going to start to elicit feelings that are maybe uncomfortable, things that they didn't expect. And again, that's going to be the result of that disruption. So, awareness is going to be key because they're going to take that awareness and they're going to analyze that emotion and what the cause was, and they're going to use that to develop a new perspective on that topic. And my big takeaway there was just the fact that disruption is what leads to learning. And over here is the problem solving organizer that I eventually kind of used as my disruption for my students, but I'm going to get to that in a bit. So it was as I was looking more at reflection in terms of literacy tasks, I kind of came to the understanding that reflection isn't just the dessert of learning. It's not always that, we usually think it's the thing you do at the end when you're all done with a project or a lesson and you reflect. But in fact, reflection is something that's going on constantly. So before reading, kids are going to become aware of text structure. So if they're aware of how a text is set up and they can start to anticipate what's to come, and they're going to be more likely to recall that key information from the text simply by making that connection to text structure. While they're reading, especially in content specific texts, so like science textbooks, math textbooks, where the kids are constantly having to consider prior knowledge, experiences. They're going to be looking at the text, they're going to be looking at graphs, and they're going to be kind of synthesizing all this information together with what they already know. This is going to be a constant process of reflection and kind of editing and revising their current understandings as they get new information and new examples. And then after reading, things like evidence-based responses. So when students have to look back at a text, they kind of have to evaluate what the most important evidence was to support a given idea or their opinion. And so as I was looking at these different types of reflection throughout literacy tasks, it kind of got me thinking of another area that incorporates all these things, but that typically maybe isn't associated with literacy, and that's math, specifically with word problems. Um, Kids, as they approach word problems, are going to start to get an awareness of the different types of problems. They might be able to kind of have an idea of cue words or keywords that are going to help them be able to anticipate the type of problem they're going to get. While they're solving problems, they're going to be looking back at the text, they're going to be looking at the prompt, they're going to be assessing what parts they need, what parts they don't, they're going to be bringing in some prior knowledge, maybe some similar problems that they've done. And then afterwards, being able to explain their work, being able to verbalize why they chose a certain strategy or why a certain set of steps was something that they had to do. So these three things I kind of all connected back to math, and so that's really what I decided to focus on with the rest of my research. And so I did a little looking into the different types of responses for math. So there's kind of three separate groups of response types. You've got ones that are content-based, so asking kids to write about math concepts and relationships. So something like, how do you know that 1/4 is greater than 1/5? Explain your thinking. So again, prompting kids to kind of make a personal connection to a math idea. Then you have a process type question that has to do with problem solving, and these might be the ones where kids write out the steps that they took to solve a problem. Or they could brainstorm what they already know about solving similar problems to one that they're given. And then you have effective ones. So looking at kids' attitudes and opinions toward a problem or a concept. So asking kids, what step are you likely to forget in this process? And how can you help yourself remember it? So kind of that more individual awareness of math habits. And there's a number of benefits to incorporating writing into math. It puts a great emphasis on real-world application of math concepts. So usually word problems are ones that are incorporating some kind of a realistic scenario. And so writing about it is helping the kids to answer that question that they probably ask a lot and saying, when am I ever going to use this in real life? This is a great way to kind of draw attention to that. It also promotes an awareness of when, why, and how to apply certain math concepts. I found that a lot of times kids can look at a math problem and they just kind of solve it out of rote memory, and they don't really take time to consider why it is that a certain strategy makes sense for a certain type of problem. So requiring that writing and that reflection is going to make them more aware of that. It's going to challenge students to explain their thinking by linking logic to math concepts. So being able to look at a problem and explain why that problem's setup can be solved with a particular strategy. And then I also like that in reflecting, in writing in math, the new perspectives that the kids are getting can be applied almost immediately. Because that math curriculum tends to move a lot more quickly than in other areas, that new learning is going to be something that kids can apply almost right away. So that kind of brings me back to my whole idea of disruption leading to learning. So when I was approaching my lessons for this, I kind of wanted to do a disruption in two ways for my students. One way is I wanted to give them a series of multi-step, little more complex, real-world problem-solving situations. And then I also wanted to challenge them to reflect at the end of those problems and to kind of pull in that routine piece, because that's ultimately what I wanted for my kids, was to give them a tool they could use to help promote that awareness of why they chose to approach a problem in a certain way. And so I created this problem solving organizer, and this was kind of my routine reflection that I wanted for them. So it kind of challenged them to break down a heftier problem by focusing in what is the problem you're trying to figure out. So a lot of times I find kids go in and they solve a problem, but they don't even really read what the problem's asking them for. So they might have an incomplete answer, or they may skip over like the step that they actually wanted as the answer. It's kind of just zeroing in on what is the problem actually asking. Asking about what do you already know from the problem. So putting in important data, keywords, maybe some prior knowledge. What do you need to know to solve the problem? So this is kind of where they're going to focus in on maybe what type of math they're going to have to do. Maybe there's a missing number or a missing piece of data that they're going to need to find, which then kind of segues here into the showing your work. So how are you going to figure out that piece of information you're missing? And then my favorite part, so explaining why the answer makes sense. So the work they did here, why does that make sense for the problem? So the first CDL lesson that I did with them was a proportion lesson. Because I teach in a multi-age classroom, my math is very individualized, so I have a lot of different math groups that are kind of self-paced. So I do a lot of blended learning with technology and face-to-face learning just to allow the kids to be able to move at their own pace. So this is something that I did with all of my math groups, but the ones that I'm going to share with you are that smaller group of kids who tend to do well in math but struggle with taking more abstract ideas and math concepts and applying them to a situation. So these are the kids that tend to do a really great job whenever they can use manipulatives or some kind of a visual that demonstrates the math. But when it gets more abstract, they tend to struggle. So that's what I'm going to kind of focus on in these lessons. So the first one I did was when math gives you lemons. And this was, like I said, for a proportion unit. We had just learned about ratios, and then we were getting into what are proportions. So the situation was that I gave kids 3 labeled cups of lemonade and then 1 test cup. And the kids had to identify which labeled cup tastes the same as the test cup, and then eventually come up with why does math help give us the answer to that. Like I said, this was a group of 3 7th grade students who tend to struggle with abstract concepts and prefer those concrete experiences. For bridging, we did a thing called Flood the Table, where you give them a big chart paper and a series of like prompt questions, and they can respond to as many or as few as they want. It's kind of in a short amount of time. It's kind of like that brain vomit where they just sort of write down everything they can think of in that moment just to sort of get their thoughts flowing. So some questions that I had written were, what are ratios? What are some examples? How do you know if 2 ratios are the same? What if one ratio is larger than the other? Can they still be equal ratios? And then a really big focus question that would eventually go with our organizer is, what do you notice about the taste of the cup with each different ratio? Which ratios match the test cup? And then how can they taste the same if the ratios are different? Their exhibits that they did were a diagram of our taste test, and then again that reflection piece was that problem solving organizer. So here were the 3 students' exhibits. And just to give you some background, the 3 cups, one of them had the correct ratio. That was A. B had way too much powder, so it was really, really sour. And then C was very watered down. So after testing them, the kids I asked them to draw a picture of what they thought was happening with the cups. So student number 1 really struggled, like how to draw something that they tasted. So they kind of looked on student number 2's paper with the whole cup idea, but then I made them kind of, after they had drawn the cups, go off on their own and kind of try to draw out what they thought. And they did kind of get that idea that the yellow powder, there's a lot of that in B, and there's a lot of water in C. Student 2 was a little bit ahead in the proportions curriculum, so they'd already seen some similar visuals showing how proportions are really just equal ratios. So theirs looks extra snazzy with these visuals. Again, because I think they reference some pictures from the textbook that kind of show those relationships using shapes. And then my last student really struggled with how to draw a picture of this. So in talking with them, he kind of talked about how he could tell by the taste, but also by looking at the colors. So I had him draw the colors of each of the cups and then to show me which ones tasted the same. And so emojis are his answer there. But he did get it right, the fact that A and the mystery cup were the ones that were the same. So we went through the problem solving organizer together. And really what I wanted them to realize was that what they needed to do to help prove their answer with math is they needed the recipe for the cup, for each cup. So they could taste it, they could look at the color, but they needed that recipe. They needed the data to support that. So we did this one together. I gave them the table with the cups and the test cup, and we worked together to do our proportions. And then we talked through how we would need to, when we're explaining it, explain all parts of the process. So cup A tastes the same because the recipe was just doubled for those parts. Okay. Then we looked at if the powder is doubled but not the water, it's too sour, and that was like cup B. And then if the water is doubled but not the powder, it's too weak, like cup C. So it really drew the kids into the fact that when you're dealing with ratios, you have to apply the same change to both the numbers. So if you're going to increase it by a factor of 2, you're going to have to multiply by 2 for the numerator and the denominator. Okay, you can't just do one or the other. The second lesson we did was called Tasty Proportions, and it was kind of a follow-up to the lemonade one. So the situation I gave them was that you want to make your favorite recipe for both classes, so different math classes. What do you need to do with the recipe to make sure it tastes right, even though you're making more? This was a group of 2 7th grade students. Our bridge was past the paper, so I had different headings on pieces of paper, and they had to pass those papers between each other, answering the question and then responding to what the other person had said, just to kind of get, again, activating those prior knowledge and even drawing back to the lemonade problem. Our main focus question was, how can you use proportions to increase the size of our recipe? Will unit rate help? And is this a realistic way to increase a recipe? Their exhibit was their recipe cards, and again, reflection was that problem-solving organizer. So again, trying to establish that routine. So here's some example of student work. So they had to select a recipe and break down the original amount for the ingredients, find a unit rate, and then multiply to get the amount for 35 servings. Again, really emphasizing the fact that with proportions, you have to apply the same change to each part in order to keep it proportional. So in this instance, it was to increase it times 35 for 35 people. Here's the other one. So for this one, I had the kids write out the first part together, but without my help. I just gave them the focus question. So why do you need to keep ingredients proportional when you change a recipe? So they wrote down what they already knew. So the normal recipe, normal servings. They knew it had to taste the same. And then they also knew that to solve proportions or to figure out if 2 ratios are proportional, they can cross multiply. So I was really proud that they had remembered that from a previous lesson. And then what they needed to know is how much do you need for one person, and then how much do you need for 35 people. Obviously, their work were in those recipe charts. And then to help them with our written reflection piece, I asked them some guiding questions and they answered them. So, why do you need a unit rate? They said that the unit rate can tell you the ingredient amount for one person. So then I asked, well, how can a unit rate be used to find the amount for 35 people? So then they said that you can multiply your unit rate by 35 because there's 35 people. And then lastly, I asked them, what's not realistic about this problem and what would be a better solution? So I wrote down exactly what they said. It can be hard to measure decimal amounts. It's better to do it by nice numbers so you can measure, like 3 or 5, until you have enough. So I really, in my verbal prompts here, I just broke down our focus question into more manageable pieces for them to answer. And, it's not perfect, but they really did hit on that idea that, you should use round, nice, as they call them, numbers to increase it. So you may end up with more than you need, but you're not going to be stuck with decimal amounts. And then the last one we did is called dueling discounts. So dueling discounts is playing off of Black Friday. So the situation was that the kids have $20 off coupon and a 20% off coupon that they can use at Target. And the question for them is, what is the better deal for the items you want to buy? Again, I worked with those same 2 students. We did another pass the paper for bridge, and the prompt questions I gave them was, what do coupons allow customers to do? Have you used a coupon before? What does it mean to have a % off coupon? Is a $1 off coupon the same as a % coupon? And after that, their main focus question is, when is it a better deal to use a 20% off coupon instead of a $20 off coupon? And then how will you solve the problem differently for each coupon? Their exhibit was a T-chart, and then their reflection again is their problem solving. So here's some example of the student work. On our learning management website, they had a list. They had the pictures and the prices for the items listed, and then it was their job to show what the price would be with a $20 off coupon, and then the price with the 20% off coupon, and then they had to circle which was the better deal. So my intention with this was that they'd realize that with this desk example, which essentially cost $100, the coupons would give you the same discount. So it was my hope that in giving that example for them to solve, that they would realize that anything less than $100, you'd want to use your $20 off coupon because that would represent greater than 20% of the price. But then if you had an item that costs more than $100, you'd want to use that 20% off coupon because that will give you more than $20 off. So they solved the problems and they actually did really well with that. When it came to the organizer, this student did a great job with isolating the pieces of information that they were given and then what they needed to know. So the costs and the discounts for the items, and then they needed to figure out which was cheaper. They did choose an example. They didn't choose that $100 example, which would have been, I think, the best way to illustrate the answer to this problem, but they did choose the TV, and then they were able to explain how that example you would want to use so they explained how you'd want to use the 20% off coupon because if you subtract $20, you would have to pay still the $1479.99, but at the 20% discount, you'd only pay $1,200. So they were able to verbalize what their answer was and how they were able to solve it, one way using $20 off and the other way 20% off. This student, again, did a pretty good job of at least filling in really generally the parts of the organizer. So what do they already know about the problem? So they were able to go through and they said that the majority of the items, the $20 off works better. So definitely reflective that they were able to see that pattern. And they said that they needed to figure out which coupon is best. And they used an example here. They did do a $100 example, which I thought was pretty great. So they showed how they solved it with $20 off, and then they figured out what 20% was, and then subtracted that. So they were able to show that both of them would give you $80. And then they really kind of struggled with the explanation, and at first they said, because all the work I did adds to more than $20. Well, then they kind of crossed that out and thought, if it's less than 20, then it will be cheaper. So, or if it's less than 100, it will be cheaper. So they're kind of dancing around that idea that $100 is that break-even point, but they didn't really get that idea that the $20 is better if you're less than $100. So after doing that, I had the kids just record really quickly their reactions and reflections to 3 different questions. So how do you feel about the problem-solving organizer? How has the organizer changed the way you think about problems with many steps? And if you had to do these problems over again, would you choose to use the organizer? Why or why not? So here are their honest reflections.
How do you feel about the problem-solving organizer? Well, I like them in a way because it helps me break down the problem so I can understand it more. But sometimes they're hard, just depending on the problem. How has it changed the way you think about complex problems? It's made me think more about them and understand it more. But they're kind of a pain to do, but I know that I have to do them. If you had to do the same problem again, would you use the organizer? I would not, just because they're pains. I don't really care for them, but if I have to do them, I do them. I mean, because then I understand it more, but they're just a pain. But I know that I have to do them because then I more understand the problem.
So what I like about that reflection is you could definitely identify the emotions that she was experiencing from that disruption in her learning, kind of saying that the organizers were a pain, but then at the same time she kind of got that idea that I was going for, that they help you break down a problem. They help make it easier to understand the problem. I particularly like where she said that she wouldn't use it again, but that it also makes the problem easier. So I don't know. I thought that was interesting how she kind of talked her way around that and came to that conclusion that even though it's kind of a pain in the butt, it still had some value in helping her learning. Here's the second student.
Okay, the first question is, how do you feel about the problem-solving organizer? I don't really like it because it takes extra time and it isn't necessary because you're doing what you've already done, except in writing way. And then the second question is, how has it changed the way you think about complex problems? It doesn't really change the way I think about it at all, that much, besides having everything kind of put out in an easier way to understand it. And the last question is, if you had to do the same problem again, would you use the organizer? No, because it takes extra time, and because I so long as I know how to do the problem, I don't need to have this doing what I've already done. and shown that I can do. And yeah.
What I like about that reflection there is how he says that he didn't like it because it's like you're doing what you already did, but in writing. And I love that he said that because I think what I see with a lot of my kids is that they view math as, okay, I did the problem, I'm done. So, they don't really take that time to stop and think about the process behind what they just did. So I love that he kind of touched on that. And I also thought it was kind of funny too how he said it didn't really change the way that he thought about the problems, except that it made them easier because it laid it all out. So again, I'm really glad that they recognized that, and he kind of talked his way back around to the fact that, even though he didn't like it and it was kind of a pain, like he said, and it took extra time, it still helped lay out the problem in an easier way for him. So as far as my kind of results and reflections, a couple things really came to mind after doing this 3 times. I found that, in just those 3 experiences, the explanation portion of the organizer is at this point is much more effective as a conversation between the student and I with some guided questions rather than just having them know automatically how to explain a problem. So I think it's definitely something that we can continue to work towards, but I think I'm going to modify the organizers now to be more specific to each problem so that last portion, that explanation part, has questions, more specific questions that the kids can respond to, because I think at this point in time it's just too much for them to anticipate what those questions are that they need to answer and then answer them. So doing something more similar to like that second example where I asked them some prompting questions about, why do you need a unit rate? How can you use a unit rate? Doing something more like that. I love that both of the kids touched on the fact that this page kind of helps them lay out the parts of the problem. And then I also like too, and this was kind of an unintended result, but in the work pages that I gave the kids for the problems, so the organized charts for the last 2 problems, I think that really helped, especially for the dueling discounts, draw attention to the fact that a $20 off coupon and a 20% off coupon are completely different, and they need to be solved in completely different ways. So even just in the way I presented the problems to the kids with those worksheets, I think it helped their brains to kind of see the different parts of the problem and how they would need to be solved because they were multi-step problems. So that was kind of a bonus that I took away just in creating that shell for them to show their work in. Actually, I think helped them break down and digest the problem. And another thing that I found too in using these is that it kind of created a language that I could use with the students on other problems. So I kind of found myself as I was working with them saying things like, okay, what do you already know about this problem? What are you trying to find out about this problem? What do you also need to know? Doing things like asking, why did you choose to do it that way? Or does that really answer the question they're asking? So just even if we're not using those organizers, I still found myself going back and using some of those phrases. And so as I kind of look back on this whole entire process of reflection and CDL and brain-based learning, I kind of found that overall it's just an opportunity for the kids to become really aware of their personal thought processes and to kind of synthesize what they've learned to get a really well-supported conclusion. So whether that conclusion is, content-based, where they're answering a question, or if it's more of an insightful learning about how they feel, like about the organizers, just that idea of taking multiple experiences and putting them together so that they really learn. And as I kind of look back, I can see with this process of reflection has a lot of really strong ties to CDL and brain-based learning. So that whole idea of a disruption in the process of routine relates directly to the fact that the brain loves novelty and that new or unusual situations are going to start triggering the alerting systems in the brain. The awareness of having uncomfortable or unusual feelings, something that they didn't expect, ties back into that whole idea of needing a positive emotional learning environment, something that is going to increase motivation, but at the same time provides the kids with a safe place to engage in those challenges. I can tell you a lot of my kids, when they saw those problems, were really intimidated because they were a lot more involved than what we traditionally do. But I feel like because I have that really good positive bond with them, they felt comfortable being able to kind of dig in and get the wrong answer sometimes before they arrived at the right one. That whole idea of analyzing emotions and their causes kind of links back to how those multiple experiences give a variety of stimuli. So it's always constantly enriching the kids and improving retention. So being aware of their learning is constantly building more and more connections, and that reflection is building more and more connections to prior learning. So it's not just I solved the problem and I'm done, but it's that repeated mulling over process. And then their new development that they have, that new perspective, is essentially a bridge to further learning. So like I talked about earlier, that whole reflective process is something, especially in math, that they can apply almost immediately to new learning.